Coach Amber here, and today I'm going to chat a bit about long-term athletic development in the powerlifter and how it compares to long-term athletic development in a field sport player or a general population client. Now, long-term athletic development originally stemmed from strength and conditioning coaches training athletes for the Olympics. The Olympics are on an every 4-year cycle, so that every 4-year cycle allowed coaches to have and create a longer and larger plan for the athlete to run through so that they were peaked for the Olympics. I also like to call this reverse engineering. You're taking the goals of the athlete and where you want them to be on the day of performance, and you're mapping backwards the steps that they need to take in order to achieve that goal. Now, programming and periodizing for powerlifting is much different than programming and periodizing around a set season for field sports such as soccer, football, lacrosse. Many of these sports have a dedicated season that you can kind of plan around for long-term development, whereas powerlifters can sign up for a meet, in 6 weeks or 8 weeks. And some of them will give you a greater opportunity to create some long-term development strategies. Let's say more so your intermediate to advanced lifters who potentially are competing in nationals and other large meets that you have an abundant amount of time to be able to plan for. But for the most part, we need to be a bit more adaptable in our programming and periodization strategies for powerlifters because there is that short-term element. However, I do try to push a lot of my powerlifters to plan, which allows for more long-term development and growth between their platform appearances. Now, why do I do that? One, this allows us to explore hypertrophy and volume accumulation phases. Now, why are these two phases so important? Well, if you pursue hypertrophy training as a powerlifter, you're going to improve your cross-sectional area of your musculature, which is going to improve your potential to produce force or get stronger. Within that, powerlifting requires so much sagittal plane, low rep, and uniformity in its movements that it's important for athletes in the long run to expose themselves to some sort of variety. Because with this variety comes more longevity. The squat, bench, and the deadlift can be very monotonous, and sometimes you can find that athletes are getting burnt out and they end up quitting instead of staying in the sport for a long period of time, which it requires for them to get stronger and stronger. So, with this long-term planning, you might sacrifice an athlete being on the ready should they decide to compete in a meet in the short term because you're shying away from specificity. Variety is on the opposite end of the spectrum from specificity. So I have an athlete who just competed about 4 weeks ago in a Powerella and is now competing again in 8 weeks in another Powerella. I had originally planned for them to have a long-term development protocol that included some hypertrophy and some volume accumulation and kind of phasing into strength, and then maybe, realization or a peaking period where we kind of tested their ability or the how well that their previous training had worked. But I had previously mapped out kind of, several phases that weren't specific to powerlifting. But this is why we need to be ready to adapt and make a shift in our programming. And there are lots of tools to do that, but that is beyond this podcast today. So with variety comes a little bit more longevity, a little bit more of a change up in their training, keeps them interested and changes the training up enough so that they don't feel like they're getting burnt out. The other thing that happens or occurs during training for a powerlifting meet is that there are lots of very heavy training sessions at or above 90% of their 1 rep max. That can have some detrimental effects on ligaments and tendons. Training at lower percentages to relative intensities or RPEs. So training at lower percentages and pushing those lower percentages for higher reps that get them within a specific parameter to failure tends to have a less detrimental effect on the tendinous structures, which actually have a longer recovery curve than your muscles or your cardiovascular system. So that long runway tends to allow for those tendinous structures to recover and heal after being kind of beat on for a little while with those heavier percentages. Now, what are some of the pitfalls of long-term development plans? We kind of already chatted about it. Athletes or powerlifters aren't always on the ready to jump into a meet if they find one less than 6 to 8 weeks out. They tend to be unaware whether or not they're progressing their 1 rep max because they're usually working through volume rather than hitting their singles and quote unquote testing where they're at. So a lot of my athletes who are in the midst of, hypertrophy or volume accumulation phases, they sometimes give some feedback that they're not quite sure if the training is working or if they're getting stronger. And it's because they're not meant to know that. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't run some sort of, testing peaking phase with them. It's just that we tend to work through a bit more of those developmental blocks rather than peaking blocks. And sometimes that can make it really hard to understand how much growth you've actually made. Now, if you coach general population clients, you can long-term develop all you want. You can work backwards from a year or 6 months because they don't necessarily have that hard end stop of having to be prepared. So this is talking more towards, the preparation of athletes for a competition versus long-term development for anyone who's looking for general fitness goals. That you could program as far back or as far out as you wanted because we know where they want to go and we can, give them a bit more of that linear progression versus powerlifting might require a little bit more thought and change up in the programming in order to make sure that they're prepared to step on the platform. Now, what does a long-term development structure typically look like for a powerlifter? I've kind of mentioned and touched upon this, but there's typically an off season. I can write anywhere from 1 to 3 blocks of volume accumulation or capacity with constraints and variety in their main and accessory movements, with a lot of the emphasis being on their accessory movements and anything that's going to build a bit more hypertrophy than the big 3. However, we tend to program just more constrained and or a variety of movements. So instead of maybe a back squat, we might give that sort of time to a front squat and working on different movements and strength in different movements that should help to support their back squat in competition. It doesn't always have a direct carryover. So after, 1 to 3 blocks of volume accumulation, 3 is quite a bit. I probably wouldn't write 3 in a row, but you could have several phases of, this kind of periodizing. You could do 1 block of volume accumulation, and then we can do a block or 2 of intensification that prioritizes their main movements and their comp movements in intensity and volume ranges that specifically work force production and improvement of the skill in the main movements. So intensity in anywhere from 70 to 85%. Remember, up and around 85, 90% is when we tend to push more peaking. So they're going to still be working those intensities in, the 70 to 85% range, and what the type of volume that they're going to be working in that intensity is going to pertain to, the potential RPE that you want them to hit. You want them to be working decently hard. So RPE 8s and the volume that you assign can be found using an RPE percentage chart. It's not going to be exact. If you Google RPE percentage chart, you'll find there are several out there. And, not everyone pertains to those specific percentages at that volume and that RPE, but somewhere in that ballpark is a great place to start. So you can run a block of volume accumulation, you can run a block of intensification, and then you can run a testing block or a peaking block where there is the highest specificity with high intensities to assess whether or not the previous training blocks have created your desired adaptation. And you can go ahead and you can run that back several times before an athlete gets into a meet testing and retesting and, writing new blocks or using new periodization strategies or programming strategies for that athlete, and then testing out how they work. So like I said, 1 to 3 blocks of accumulation, 1 to 2 of intensification, and then run a testing block just to make sure that the programming that you've written is giving the desired adaptation for the athlete. But that is long-term athletic development. It is a very simple concept for powerlifting, a very simple concept for general population, but again, not something that a lot of powerlifting coaches use. I've seen quite a few powerlifting coaches actually say that, they don't lean on long-term athletic development. Personally, as someone who really enjoys planning, I always have some sort of skeleton written out and planned out for my athletes. But I have also convinced myself that I need to, be able to think on my toes and be adaptable should those plans change. So whenever I write a plan, it's never set in stone. It's never something that I'm looking to follow to a T. It's more or less a plan that's there that I can feed off of. And should I need to, take a shift and call an audible, we are able to do that. Thank you for listening. If you have any questions, please feel free to find me on Instagram at ambitious_strength_ or shoot me an email at ambitious.strength9@gmail.com, and I'd be happy to chat these through with you. Thanks for listening.